At the trial, in the courtroom, there was this overwhelming sense that when he would become emotional, it was because he was sad for himself. It wasn't over remorse for what had happened.
James Shore himself helped somebody out, and he chose to go back in.
Mr. Ray senselessly and recklessly snuffed out the lives of Kirby Brown, James Shore, and Liz Newman.
There was mucus coming out of Sydney's nose and her mouth, and her eyes were rolled back in her head, and she wouldn't respond, and she was barely breathing. She was just...
This is True Crime Arizona, the podcast.
Mr. Ray, say something to the families of those people who died in the sweat lodge. What would you say to them? Mr. Ray, do you have anything to say? Say something.
Not this morning, no.
This would be a trial unlike any other. It was also in the middle of Arizona, nowhere near busy cities.
It was a daily event. It was at a courthouse far from the scene of the retreat center. You know, we had access to the courtroom. I believe it was a pool camera at the time. We were there every day. We had 2 shifts of reporters on it, a day-sider, a night-sider.
By now, it's 2011. It had been about a year and a half since 3TV's Jared Dillingham had first reported on the Sweat Lodge tragedy. He, like so many others, was curious and eager to hear what details would start to unravel in court and what attorneys on both sides would say. But even before the testimony in the courtroom began, some attorneys were already fired up and going public with things nobody had heard before. It set the scene for what was to be a dramatic trial.
James Ray and his staff claimed that they had had a channeler out at the site and that they had determined that the folks that died, that they had had an out-of-body experience and that their spirits were so happy in the transition that they didn't want to come back.
That's Ted Schmidt, an attorney who represented spiritual warrior participant Sydney Spencer. He would describe what she could remember during the tragedy and the vulnerable state she was in after the retreat.
She was in intensive care in Flagstaff for 4 days. She nearly died. She continues to experience serious vision problems, which her doctors tell me is permanent. She has lung damage, which I also understand is permanent. She has memory problems, constant headaches. She doesn't sleep. The reason he's being charged with manslaughter is because several witnesses have all independently said that during the Sweat Lodge experience, there were people vomiting, there were people passed out, people not breathing. One man trying to get out of the lodge fell into the burning rocks and burned himself. People cried out to Mr. Ray. Somebody fell into the fire. We're throwing up. This woman is not breathing. And in each incident, each time this was called to Mr. Ray's attention, his response was, leave them alone, leave them lie, we'll deal with it later. He consciously was aware that people were in terrible physical shape, and he allowed them to lie there and die rather than bringing this death march to an end.
So yeah, Ted Schmidt was going all in. He wanted that information out there before the trial started. It could only help the prosecution. At the same time, James Ray's defense attorneys began speaking out. James was given a super high bond, $5 million.
You got to post cash, you got to get property, you got to get friends and family. You know, we're trying to put all that together, but you know, the bottom line is he doesn't have that kind of disposable cash and property. James is not a wealthy guy. No. He's not able to post $5 million in bond.
This was shocking to people. I mean, remember, James had been living the life of luxury. In 2008, just a year before the Sweat Lodge tragedy, his own company grossed $9.4 million. His Beverly Hills property was worth $4 million, next to Gwen Stefani and Britney Spears. Most people would call that wealthy. Really, really wealthy. Things had clearly come crumbling down.
Court documents show he's more than $4 million in debt.
His attorneys were doing anything to get that bond down.
My client has no criminal history whatsoever.
This should not be a criminal case. This should not be a criminal case. This was an accident. And you know, I don't want to say that we're looking forward to it, but because we're going to be there, we're confident that if the truth comes out, no crime will be proven here.
The judge bought it. James's bond was reduced from $5 million to $525,000. He could post it and get out of jail.
Shackled at both his wrists and ankles, James Arthur Ray, heading to court, looks directly at the cameras, chin up. When asked if he has something to say about the charges,
Not this morning, no.
Connie Joy hadn't talked to James Ray in a while, but after all she had been through with him and the dozens of trips and retreats she had been on with him, she was ready for the trial and was a witness in it too. She saw James outside the courthouse.
I was talking to a press reporter at a Prescott where my parents live, and he comes over, pushes like right in front of me, like an inch off the front of me, to come over and just shake the hand of the reporter, just saying something about, "Oh, it's nice to meet you," whatever. Then when he turned back around, he must have been just a couple inches off my nose, and just smirked and kept going. And that's his way of letting me know I was no longer worth speaking to. I was looking for that natural human compassion to come up, and I never saw it.
Mr. Ray, how are the accommodations here in Yavapai County? Anything to say?
James Ray was trying to ignore the media as the trial frenzy began. He was pleading not guilty to 3 counts of manslaughter. Just how all of our listeners got to learn about James Ray through his speaking tours and videos in episode 1 of this podcast season, the jury would be shown those videos in court too.
And between the time of birth till the exit in the final battle, the ultimate battle, you either live an honorable life, you live with impeccability.
Both the prosecution and defense started with opening statements. The lead prosecutor was Yavapai County Attorney Sheila Polk.
Many witnesses in this trial will testify that by the end of the week, when they entered Mr. Ray's sweat lodge for the grand finale event, his heat endurance challenge, they were exhausted, mentally weak, and fully conditioned to follow Mr. Ray's instructions.
What would you do if you knew right now that the person next to you was dying? We'd say, "Judge, we need to stop this proceeding immediately."
Then it was the defense's turn.
Mr. Ray didn't force anyone to go into the sweat lodge. Mr. Ray didn't force anyone to stay in the sweat lodge. People have a right to choose for themselves that they died as a result of an accident, a tragic accident, not a crime.
the defense says near the end of the 2-hour-long ceremony, Liz Newman declined help. James Shore was helping other participants to the door, and Kirby Brown's cheers and words of encouragement were so loud she was asked to quiet down.
How is anybody supposed to know that that person is about to die? Nobody did.
It wasn't just the attorneys, detectives, and eventually the participants themselves who testified. Native Americans also took the stand, those who used sweat lodges during sacred ceremonies.
We take great offense to the likes of James Ray and the other New Age pretenders who think they can conduct our ceremonies without authorization, without sanction, or without endorsement or the proper training.
Many Native Americans filled the courtroom during the trial. They were angry.
One of the things that we're really against is the ceremonies for profit. It should be done by the Native people who know the ceremonies, that have the right to do them. It's a rite of passage that's been handed down through the ages.
Jared remembered that being a really big part of the trial, and memorable too.
The Native Americans don't do this as like a punishment. It's a sacred ceremony where, you sweat a little bit as like a cleansing type ritual, but it's not meant to, bring you to the brink of death. It's not like, that's not what it's designed for at all in their culture.
Witnesses would also testify this wasn't the first sweat lodge where people got hurt. There were issues as early as 2005, and Connie Joy said at the 2007 sweat lodge, people got sick too.
At trial, it came out that other people had been injured at these events. At the sweat lodge, another man suffered heat stroke, was sent to the hospital. That was a big bombshell at the trial because it was evidence that he knew the risk.
There had been a couple participants who spoke out to some national news outlets after the spiritual warrior disaster, but so many had tried to stay out of the spotlight. So when several of them took the stand during the trial, it would be the first time people had ever heard truly firsthand how they were feeling during all of this. The first of them to take the stand was Melissa Phillips.
He was the person I entrusted myself to in the seminar and to learn from. And I felt he had a reason behind his requests.
She was talking about James Ray and why she tried to push through the sweat lodge.
I wanted to finish what I had started. I was hoping for an enlightening moment. I didn't want to disappoint either him, the dream team, or myself.
Why, Miss Phillips, did you care about whether or not you would disappoint Mr. Ray?
That I don't know.
Melissa said she did leave the lodge at one point. It was just too much. But she didn't want to give up and went back inside. That's when she noticed a change, especially in Kirby Brown.
I said 5 or 6 times, there's something wrong. She needs to be taken out. A lot of people seemed out of it.
What do you mean by that they seemed out of it?
A lot of moaning, people lying down, some delirium, confusion.
Melissa said James did nothing to help, but she admitted she didn't do anything either.
I did nothing.
Do you know why?
I felt that if there was real danger, the Dream Team members who were stationed at the north, south, east, and west would come help us.
One of the Dream Team members there was Jennifer Haley. She was a hairdresser by trade. She also took the stand, and at first didn't like the prosecution's line of questioning.
You keep putting words in my mouth here, and I said, it may be this, it may be that, I don't know what it is. I know he purposely didn't go and kill these people.
She started to open up more the longer she was on the stand about how people viewed James at that retreat.
If you shave your head, you feel pretty vulnerable. You don't feel like yourself. There's this state of mind that goes along with shaving your head, especially if you're a woman.
Have you spoken to Ms. Polk or anyone from the Yavapai County Attorney's Office about the state's theory in this case that the participant's state of mind contributed to cause of death?
No, he was too strong with the people. They were too intimidated to make up their mind, and they wanted to make him proud, and they were a little too committed to him than to themselves.
If you had heard somebody inside the sweat lodge ceremony say somebody is unconscious or somebody is dying, what would you have done?
I would have tried to help, but I certainly wouldn't have opened that door and gone in the sweat lodge to do anything, because James is in there.
County Attorney Sheila Polk asked Jennifer why she wouldn't have gone in to help.
We believed and trusted in his teachings. You don't go against James.
Another participant took the stand, Dr. Wagner. She was in an interesting predicament. A doctor by trade, but a participant at the retreat. She told the courtroom how it unfolded for her as things started to go wrong.
It sounded like hysterical screaming.
She said she heard a man yell, "I'm going to die." The defense team questioned her.
But you didn't think he was going to die, correct?
Correct.
Because if you would, as a medical doctor, you would have got up out of your seat, went out that door, and helped him, correct?
Correct.
If you would have known that, you would have used every ability and every skill and every ounce of your energy to help those folks, correct?
Yes. I probably would have gone outside to look if I hadn't been told there's a nurse there.
Dr. Wagner was seated close to the door where James Ray was seated. But when she got up, she noticed the back of the sweat lodge was much hotter, and she saw people passed out.
The first person I tried to pick up, I was too weak to lift them, and it was because I was so hot that my strength just drained away.
She says James then tells her to go to her room, but she doesn't. She sees Liz Newman unconscious on the ground.
As I looked around, she was the only one who didn't have somebody tending to her. There was saliva and foam coming out of her mouth.
What became a focal point of this trial was how much pressure James was putting on participants to stay in that lodge. He wasn't physically locking them in there, but the jury would have to decide if his influence and words were harmful enough to have led to their deaths. Dr. Beverly Bunn, a dentist from Texas and spiritual warrior participant, took the stand next. She said she tried to crawl outside the lodge, but James Ray stopped her.
He said, "Beverly, especially you are stronger than this, and you know you can get through this. You can endure this. It's mind over matter." A man asked how he could relieve himself, and I guess he had to urinate, and he was told just to do it right there.
Beverly was Kirby Brown's roommate at the retreat. She saw Kirby inside the lodge. It was traumatic.
And I can actually see Kirby's stomach going up and down, and I recognize her because I can see her in her bikini, so I know it's her.
Doctor,
I'm sorry.
take a break.
There was a lot of screaming going on. James said, quiet down, I'm in charge here. Everyone needs to be quiet right now."
Remember when Sydney Spencer's attorney told reporters Sydney nearly died and was in the ICU for 4 days after? Beverly saw her on the brink of death.
There was mucus coming out of Sydney's nose and her mouth, and her eyes were rolled back in her head, and she wouldn't respond, and she was barely breathing. She was just...
James Ray's family stood by his side, despite what was said and what happened. His mom, Joyce Ray, spoke out.
What mother wants to see her son go through this? Very difficult. But I believe in him. He was very different from most children. Rarely had to discipline him. You would tell him yes or no, and he would just do. He was obedient, very obedient. If you disciplined and you said, "Son, don't do that," then he would do it. I mean, it was so simple. He's just always marched to the tune of a different drummer.
Even with the support of his parents, James Ray's defense team knew they were going to have to dig into new information in order to try and convince the jury there were other factors at this retreat out of James Ray's control that led to the 3 deaths. And that's where the arguments turned the blame game onto somebody else. Jared watched it unfold.
He turned on the owners of this retreat center. The Hamiltons have owned this retreat center, Angel Valley, near Sedona, for years, and they host a number of different events. You could look on their website. They have a number of different retreats there that they host, and this was one of them. They've dealt with James Ray for several years. He's held different events there. He turned on them. He said, they're the ones who built this sweat lodge. They should have known it was dangerous. This is their fault, not mine. They would respond to that. The Hamiltons responded to those accusations saying, we've worked with James Arthur Ray for years. He had this one incident where somebody had heat stroke, went to the hospital. We told him to fix things, to make changes. He said he did. This is his retreat. He packed too many people into that sweat lodge. They said it was all his fault. You know, there's one way in, one way out. This is the way he wanted it designed. They said he is a control freak, he is manipulative, and if he thought there might be any kind of problem with this sweat lodge, he would have let them know. He would have demanded changes. So they said it was all on him.
It wasn't just that. They also blamed the Hamiltons for something else too. Toxins. That seemingly came out of left field. The defense said authorities failed to investigate other potential causes of death like toxins and poisons, and quoted the medical examiner's testimony.
It's 51-49%. You can't rule out organophosphates. It's 51-49%.
They said nobody was even close to heat stroke.
People decided not to go in the sweat lodge. People went in the sweat lodge and came out. People went back in. James Shore himself helped somebody out, and he chose to go back in. Not a single person had a severely elevated temperature. Nobody was near the 104, 105, 106 mark for heat stroke.
Yavapai County Attorney Sheila Polk was going to make sure her points were heard loud and clear by the jury before they went into deliberations.
Kirby, James, and Liz all arrived at Angel Valley, full of hope and life. But when Mr. Ray took it upon himself to do this extreme event, when Mr. Ray intentionally used heat to create an altered mental state, telling participants to push through the pain in order to have a breakthrough, Mr. Ray senselessly and recklessly snuffed out the lives of Kirby Brown, James Shore, and Liz Newman. Time and time again, he chose to continue on, to ignore information that he had about people suffering, and he chose to bring in more rocks, bring in more water, create more heat, and create more steam. Mr. Ray told them that it was okay to pass out inside the sweat lodge and that they'd be taken care of. Think how different it would be if when Sidney Spencer was dragged out after the 6th, right in front of Mr. Ray, he had just stopped this event then. Ask yourselves why he did not. And in that answer lies the evidence as to why Mr. Ray is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of reckless manslaughter.
The trial lasted 50 days. That's a long trial. It was emotionally exhausting for everyone. Jared remembered something, though, that stood out about James over those months in the courtroom.
At the trial, in the courtroom, there was this overwhelming sense that when he would become emotional, it was because he was sad for himself. It wasn't over remorse for what had happened and the loss of these people who'd come to his event. That was the sense of the family members of the people who died. And that was the sense from the prosecutors as well. They tried to hammer that home. And they said he was just nothing more than a snake oil salesman, nothing more.
If James was convicted on 3 counts of manslaughter, he could have been in prison for many years. There was also a chance the jury could find him not guilty of all counts, and he would be free. Everyone held their breath as the verdict was read.
And upon our oaths, do find the defendant, James Arthur Ray, on the offense of manslaughter as a result of the death of Kirby Brown as follows: not guilty. Do find the defendant, James Arthur Ray, on the offense of negligent homicide as a result of the death of Kirby Brown as follows: guilty.
That exact same verdict was read for both James Shore and Liz Newman's deaths, too. He was convicted on 3 counts of negligent homicide, a much lesser charge than manslaughter. He would end up being sentenced to 2 years in prison. Randy Newman spoke to media outside the courthouse. He had been married to Liz Newman for 23 years.
Very tough. It's been a showstopper in our lives for some people at times. It's been very, very difficult, very trying. I spoke with Liz and my 3 children, and we're very happy with the verdict. We think justice has been served.
But not everyone felt good about this outcome. The Brown family was sickened by all they heard and learned through the trial.
He knew what he was doing was potentially very dangerous. He had seen people go unconscious. He had seen them needing to be revived. A few years earlier, someone's had permanent brain damage after the sweat lodge. So he should have been convicted of manslaughter because he had prior knowledge that what he was doing was dangerous.
Do you think he cared?
No, I don't think he cared.
Jared has reported on countless trials during his journalism career, but to this day, none have been quite like this one.
Explain, from your point of view, how the trial unfolded to lead to the verdict that was different than it could have been.
The families would say that he deserves to still be in prison for negligent homicide. The 2 years he spent, they say, will never be enough. They say, based on his behavior and the things he said afterwards and his attempts to rebuild his career, they all say that's evidence that he lacks remorse.
Former Sheriff Scott Masher looked at the entire situation from a public safety eye. If you're in charge of an event, you have to have the proper precautions in place. For Scott, that's just a non-negotiable.
You're responsible for that. You need to have medical plans and safety protocols in place. You're responsible for the health and well-being of those people. They're paying a lot of money to be there with you, and none of that happened. And they wanted out, and you're telling them no. And that's pretty reckless. Was 2 years enough for 3 lives? You know, you tell me.
James Ray's days spent in prison were going to be detailed as part of the next podcast episode this season. They still will be, just not yet. things changed when I got a Facebook message to my work account not too long after the first episode in this Sedona Sweat Lodge season dropped. I get messages about different things from viewers or listeners or community members pretty frequently, but this message caught my eye immediately because of the name, Amira Hamilton. This is what it said. Hi, Brianna. I happened to run into your recent podcast because I received a Google alert. My husband and I were owners of Angel Valley at the time and were also part of the court case against James Ray. I do remember that a while ago, somebody contacted me about the situation of 13 years ago, but I don't remember hearing any further. Could you inform me when you will be having more broadcasts or podcasts? I am open to be contacted in any form. Thanks, Amira Hamilton. Looks like we were going back to Angel Valley. I had so many questions for Amira. Next time on True Crime Arizona, the Sedona Sweat Lodge deaths.
Did you know that James was going to turn on you at the trial?
We could expect it, but we didn't know what kind of things they would come out with. A lot of things had also been mentioned about the covering of the Sweat Lodge. Tarps!
I want you to talk to me about that part, because there was that part of the trial where they said, this is the Hamiltons' fault.
I know. This whole thing about the Sweat Lodge, that was just such a bad thing. No, it was, how do you deal with it? These people were in there too long, too hot. That's simple.
True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney, and produced by Sergio Hernandez. It's a production of Arizona's Family, 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.
Looking for a new career? Welcome to Do HVAC Training Service Center in North Charleston. Enroll today in our comprehensive HVAC training hands-on field experience-based program, covering troubleshooting, maintenance, installation, and more on various HVAC systems and ductwork. We offer EPA and NAEP preparation and testing, along with various certifications. Enjoy payment options. Achieve certification in under 5 months. Enroll now for your new journey of skill development and career advancement. Log on to dewhvactrainingsc.com to inquire.